Hello and welcome. My name is Andrew Downs. I'm an associate professor of political science at IPFW. I want to welcome you to this panel known as The Role of Russia, Friend or Foe. This event is being brought to you by the Departments of History and Political Science at IPFW, as well as the American Democracy Project. And as always, we want to thank our friends at College TV for recording it and making it available. Also to WBOI for making it available, and finally to the Helmke Library for placing it on MDON. For most of 2016, it was a little difficult to avoid hearing people talk about Russia's involvement in elections here in the United States. Intelligence reports have been issued recently that confirm, or they say confirm, Russian involvement in the election here. Those reports have not been well received, including lack of a well-received reception by President-elect Donald Trump. Russian involvement, though, goes beyond elections here in the United States. There are some talk of Russian involvement in elections in Europe, whether that's through campaign contributions or social media, all of this being done to sort of manipulate public opinion and influence the outcome of the election. So what is it that Russia is doing, and why are they doing it? Today we have with us a couple of experts. We have from the Department of History, Associate Professor Livschiz, and from the Department of Political Science, Associate Professor James Toole. So let's just have ease our way into this a little bit, Jamie. What is sort of your perception of 2016 and now into 2017, Russia's involvement in elections?
Well, it was a crazy year, wasn't it, in politics in 2016. So obviously the election of Donald Trump came as a surprise to a lot of people and to a lot of pollsters as well. Let me just say a few things broadly about the election of Donald Trump as it pertains to the American voter, and more pointedly as it pertains to foreign policy. So one of the interesting things, there are going to be a lot of things we're going to sort out about Donald Trump in the coming year as we really learn what he's like as a president. But one thing we know already is that there are some big shifts underway within the Republican Party. And even during the campaign, we saw some big differences between Donald Trump and fellow Republicans over foreign policy issues. To list a few, there were disagreements over the use of nuclear weapons. There were disagreements over the importance of NATO and our relations with allies, not only in NATO, but also in East Asia with Japan and South Korea. Very big differences on trade. Remember that free trade has been a fundamental principle of the Republican Party going back decades, and Donald Trump has turned that upside down. And of course, then that brings us to the current topic, Russia. There still are very big disagreements over Russia among Republicans, with of course Donald Trump taking a very sort of soft or friendly approach toward Russia, and many, and I think it's very fair to say the vast majority of Republicans, certainly within the national security establishment, being very skeptical of Russian motives.
Mm-hmm. And what's your perception? Was it a crazy year? Is Jamie right? Crazy year?
Took the words right out of my mouth. Definitely interesting. As a Soviet historian, certainly it was absolutely fascinating to see the prominence that discussions about Russia played in our political, in specific American political discourse, not just when it came to foreign policy, which is fairly, which is not very unusual, but when it actually came to issues of domestic policy, in particular the questions about, potential interference. And again, as a historian, one of the really interesting things is that for so long, especially during the Cold War, but not just during the Cold War, kind of this the paranoia about Russian influence, right? The paranoia that the Soviets or the communists are manipulating American politics is something that became almost a trope, that was used in a variety of different ways, and in a way, it actually became discredited. It was seen as something that was used as a political club to discredit your opponents, and so it was interesting to see it play out this year, where you had so many people very reluctant to bring it up because of the ideological baggage that the discussions of Russian and Soviet interference have had, in the face of some facts that seem to point to that in this one case, perhaps it was not just paranoia, but there may have actually been something behind some of those, some of those discussions.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's get to now the more specific accusations that have been made so far. They fall into a number of categories, but go ahead and pick your favorite category. What are the specific accusations that have been made?
It's hard to pick a favorite, so I'm gonna. I feel like I should start not with my favorite, but I think with the one that has been discussed the most, and that's this question of cybersecurity and hacking. And there's some confusion about what actually was hacked, right? There's of course the hacking of emails from Hillary Clinton's advisors, the hacking of the DNC documentation. It is important to note that some things there was talk about Hillary Clinton's server being hacked. Actually, that material was released. It was just dumped at the same time, and so there was some confusion there. There was some talk about the possibility of Russian hacking of election of voting machines, and that's it was floated out there. That one has a little bit less support, factual support behind it. The other important thing, of course, is related to the cybersecurity issue is the role that WikiLeaks played in disseminating the information that was obtained by some questionable means, and of course one of the issues being that there's suspicion that Russia or Russian affiliated hackers fed the information to WikiLeaks to allow them to disseminate it, where WikiLeaks was able to use the credibility it accumulated in previous years of kind of speaking truth to power to be able to do so. My personal favorite is the use of the way that Russia used social media, and in particular sort of this use of trolls, the so-called troll factories, people who were hired and paid by the Russian government to spend up to 12 hours a day in American social media, creating accounts that are ostensibly that were presented as Trump-supporting accounts, conservative accounts, who spend a lot of time attacking, Trump critics of Trump, posting supportive messages about Trump, creating kind of a certain kind of narrative within within social media. That one I think is in some ways the most interesting, simply because how relatively new it is and kind of the creative use of new media to achieve some interesting results.
Well, I do want to add one thing to the list of hacking. You mentioned the election machines, but we should remember that there was actual hacking of voter registration systems, right, which is a fairly substantial and important component to remember. That to keep the two separate. Election machines are different than a voter registration file, but there was hacking of the voter registration file. And really, when you took the social media thing, 2008 was the first time that it was really used extensively, or what we would have considered to be extensively. It's grown dramatically since then, and this may be another one of those sort of watershed moments in terms of elections and the use of social media. Jamie, follow up to that?
Yeah, I have 2 points relevant to that. One is it's interesting to see how, regardless of what specific damage was caused by Russia in the electoral campaign, whether in the campaign itself or perhaps with the machinery of the election, probably what matters most is the uncertainty that it caused and the doubt that it raised in many people's minds about the legitimacy of the American electoral system. And so I think when we talk about Russian election hacking, we have to keep in mind that it's not just about, and maybe not that much about in most countries, the actual calculation of votes. It's more about the atmosphere that's created, about the fundamental questioning of the effectiveness of democracy and democratic institutions in the West that I think is kind of Putin's main goal, and probably the only main objective he can achieve. But that's a worthy goal from the sort of Russian strategic self-calculation that Putin is, of course, relying on. The second point I would raise is that when it comes to Russian hacking, we again see, of course, the divide within the Republican Party. On January 5th, we had hearings in the Senate Armed Service Committee on cyber hacking and foreign cyber threats in general. And here's a quote from Senator Lindsey Graham, of course, a Republican stalwart in the national security establishment. And he's talking here about Julian Assange, the founder of WikiLeaks, which, of course, collaborated with Russia, it seems, in a lot of this destabilization. And Lindsey Graham says of Julian Assange, and here's a quote from the 4th of January, he seemed to have two choices now. Some guy living in an embassy on the run from the law for rape, who has a history of undermining American democracy and releasing classified information to put our troops at risk, or the 17 intelligence agencies sworn to defend us. I'm going with them. So, very, very bold, outspoken criticism of Trump and, of course, support for U.S. intelligence agencies.
There are a lot of people who are saying that the interesting thing about the briefing that Trump is going to receive is that you have in one place basically the leaders of the intelligence agencies who will, in a very much one voice, say, this is what we found.
Yeah.
You can disregard it if you wish, but this is what we found. It's obviously not going to be a public meeting, but a lot of people see this as an opportunity for the intelligence community to try and convince the president-elect that what they do has value and may actually be quite accurate and something that he should pay more attention to.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think they will be speaking more or less within one voice. You have some dissenters, like Donald Trump's nominee for the national security, his national security advisor, to be his national security advisor, Michael Flynn, who's long questioned, who's kind of like fomented divisions between defense on the one side and the CIA and the other intelligence agencies on the other. But for the most part, yeah, it's going to be a very unified message that Russia was deeply implicated. Yeah.
And we should mention, of course, that Flynn, in addition to kind of being a peculiar figure in this particular community, is also somebody who is on record, kind of being, visiting Russia on numerous occasions, being celebrated at parties. There are photographs of him kind of sitting at tables in proximity to Putin. Somebody who's featured very heavily on Russia Today, the kind of the propaganda, English language propaganda tool of the Russian government. So one of the interesting things that I think that this raises is that on the one hand you have this, and I agree, I agree with Jamie. I think the overwhelming majority of the national security community, people who have devoted their lives to actually studying this, the experts, right? The experts on the subject do seem to speak with one voice. But I think one of the things that made this year such a crazy year is the undermining of people's expertise and sort of this idea that, well, it's just an opinion, right? So yes, all these people who devoted their lives to studying this subject say this, but somebody else says something else, and these are two equally valid opinions, and I guess we'll just kind of, we'll just have to see. And I think this is one of the things that really contributes to the uncertainty that Jamie mentioned earlier. And the potential instability.
I'd just say on a personal note, as a political science professor, when I started teaching political science full-time in 2000, I felt that one of my main jobs was to get people to question received wisdom, because my students would come into the classroom and they would just accept sort of the traditional logic that was out there for how things work. And now it's completely different. Now I find myself constantly encouraging people not to just believe anything that comes along, because now it's a very different mindset where we're just, any old fact that gains traction, seeming fact that gains traction on the internet suddenly seems to have the same amount of credibility as facts that are very well established by people who are experts in the field.
And just since you mentioned this, I want to jump ahead for just a second. I think this is actually a key part of Russia's strategy, right? I mean, obviously Russia is not I don't want to make it seem like Russia is the one using the internet he's the only country or institution.
Wait, others are using the internet inappropriately?
Inappropriately. But certainly, I mean, this is a really, really important part of Russia's kind of cyber strategy to contribute to the undermining of both kind of broadly, to go back to Jamie's point about the undermining of certainty, but also to dump so much information, random information into the discourse on certain subjects, where it becomes practically impossible to differentiate what's true and what's not, right? Precisely to kind of just to undermine experts, to undermine expertise, to undermine the concept of fact as not just a random thing, but actually something connected to reality of some sort.
Well, this really is one of the challenges that we face in terms of social sciences and humanities. There quite often is no one right answer. And so as you said, you spend time trying to make sure that students will question conventional wisdom, that they will learn to evaluate data and then make a good judgment. When you have this amount of variability in what we're looking at to begin with, or the potential that something is wrong, it becomes kind of easy to sow the seeds of lack of trust in things. Well, let's move from there, though, to the actual election results themselves. In terms of the popular vote, as everyone knows, Hillary Clinton managed to win the popular vote, but in terms of the Electoral College, that was won by Donald Trump and won actually quite comfortably by Donald Trump. I don't know that there are too many people who are saying that Russian involvement was necessarily the reason that we saw the outcome that we saw. I know there are some people who want to look at individual states and say, well, no, the race was so close there that with a little less involvement or no involvement, maybe the results would have shifted. But in the end, there were things going on domestically that were feeding into some of that as well. James Comey's announcements, those sorts of things. But in the end, these are the results that we have, right? I mean, that's the way it turned out, right, James?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's no real questioning about the outcome of the election, and I think I think there shouldn't be, and yeah, I don't think very many people take seriously the idea that Russia turned the election. Russia didn't turn the election, but Russia, again, as we said, perhaps undermined some confidence.
And certainly this brings up the conversation about whether or not the Electoral College is something that needs to exist or not. And that's a subject for another time, I think, that we'll get together on that. Anne?
Oh, I was just going to make a comment. I mean, I swear I'm not a big conspiracy theory person, but I did want to mention that I have seen some people pointing to the fact that in a number of battleground states, the results were so close and the percentage was so similar from state to state that there are some people who have kind of pointed to this as saying that what are the chances that you can have so many close results by roughly the same by roughly the same margin completely different from what the polling beforehand was. Again, I'm happy to blame Russia for lots of things. I'm not comfortable. I'm not quite comfortable with kind of pushing it quite this far, because I do think that ultimately Americans are going to have to take responsibility for the decisions for the decisions they made and the motivations for the decisions that they made. But again, to keep coming back to this question of uncertainty, I think. Again, the discussions about the Electoral College, the discussions about the popular vote, the discussions about how close everything was, the counting, and so on. I think ultimately it did contribute to the undermining of the faith in kind of the sanctity of the electoral process, which could do long-term damage, right? I mean, we already have fairly low voter turnout. There's already a lot of people who don't feel invested in the process, and certainly feeling like this is something that can be manipulated by whether internal forces or external forces is something that I do think had long-term will have long-term damage on the relationship that many Americans have with institutions and the electoral process.
No, we should keep in mind that prior to the election, it was Trump and Trump supporters who were saying, no, the system is flawed, the system is flawed.
Right.
Afterwards, it was Clinton supporters who were saying, wait a minute, the system's flawed, the system's flawed. So, we do have to wait and see what the results are before we really know who wants to say the system is flawed in general. Now, as I mentioned at the start of this, the accusations about Russian involvement go beyond U.S. borders to several elections in Europe. And so, Jamie, give us a bit of an overview. Where are we looking at potential Russian involvement in Europe?
Mm-hmm. Well, we're looking at two different types of things. First, we have allegations of hacking. The German Bundestag, the legislature, the parliament in Germany, its computer servers were hacked in 2015, and that's been tied to Russia. In more recent hacking of German members of parliament and of party offices, including Chancellor Angela Merkel's governing Christian Democratic Union Party, that hacking occurring in 2016, including what seemed to be a special focus on the German state of Saarland, which holds regional elections coming up in March of this year, and a lot of that hacking took place in August. A cyber attack cut internet and phone service for 900,000 Germans just in November of 2016. That also has been connected to Russia. And there have been allegations that Russia was involved in the spread of fake news in the Italian referendum vote that was held in the first week of December 2016. So then there's another group, another sort of, in addition to the hacking, sort of another set of things, which I think we might just call sort of Russian support, overt support, or on the other hand, support of important European leaders for the Russian agenda. Russia loaned $11.7 million US to the French National Front in 2014. French National Front, of course, a right-wing party in France that has a somewhat serious chance of taking the presidency in elections coming up this April and May in France. Almost as troubling is that the man likely to go up against the National Front in those elections, French conservative François Fillon, has been very friendly toward Russia in the past, including calling for the lifting of sanctions on Russia as a result of Russia's invasion and annexation of Crimea. And then we have a right-wing politician named Geert Wilders in the Netherlands, who, and Dutch elections are coming up in March. He's very likely, and his party are likely to do very well. And his campaign actually has a slogan called "Make the Netherlands Great Again." So very, very direct lifting of wording from the Trump campaign. And I could go on. There are other examples as well, but that at least gives you a flavor.
Didn't Trump copyright that?
I don't know. It's a good question. I'm not sure how much money there'd be to make on that. I guess there's a lot, so maybe so.
Let's go back for a second to the Italian elections. You mentioned that there were some things there that may have influenced things a little bit, but at the same time, there was a very ill-advised claim made by the Italian leader. I mean, no one in their right mind would say, if this referendum fails, I will step down. I mean, he put all of his eggs in that one basket. That was ill-conceived, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I think just about any political analyst would say that he was crazy. This is a pretty popular Italian prime minister who was very well regarded abroad as well, for his moderation, his technical prowess, his understanding of politics, economics, etc. And he very stupidly linked his continuance in office with the success of this referendum. And when the referendum failed, he had no choice but to resign as prime minister, which has created a tumult in Italian politics.
And what's sort of interesting is what he was trying to do was, he would say, government modernization. Right. That was the purpose of the referendum.
It was structural, it was institutional. This referendum was not over some passionate political issues. This was a very mundane, technical, complicated set of institutional reforms. So to tie your career to that is foolish. There is no need to do that. You could easily have said, look, this is a package of reforms intended to improve governance in our country, and while I support it, but if it doesn't pass, then we move on. But instead, now Italy's in a deeper crisis than it was before.
I bring this up only to emphasize that campaigns do matter. We've said this many times in many discussions. Campaigns matter. When you tie your success or failure to an issue like this, something that's not really going to get people excited, you suddenly have turnout issues, you have issues in terms of explaining a complicated issue to people, as well as changing something that's been done a certain way for a long time. I mean, you really sort of set your opponents up for an opportunity to defeat you. And so campaigns do matter. Even when people start talking about Russia or anyone else getting that involved in campaigns, or elections, I should say, campaigns matter, and the involvement seems to be maybe able to work around the edges, but it's not going to flip something completely on its head. No. Anne?
I also, in addition to the examples that Jamie gave, I wanted to emphasize one particular region of Europe, and that's kind of the Balkans. I think that's one of the, to go before the Balkans. One of the interesting things, and I think that this comes through in the examples that Jamie gave, is how diverse kind of Russia is. When Russia invests in other countries' elections, it seems to diversify kind of its offerings, right? Ultimately, it's not. There's an expectation, of course, that somebody like Le Pen, in exchange for that money, is going to talk about how awesome Russia's annexation of Crimea was, and is going to be loyal and supportive. But ultimately, it's not necessarily the most. It's not the most logical thing, perhaps, to see the Russian government supporting, right-wing, practically, neo-Nazi political parties, and which they do a lot, but they also support other nationalist parties, as well. So there's kind of this interesting diversification of investment, because there's no guarantee who's actually going to win. And as far as the kinds of intervention, we see money invested in the campaigns. We see the social media campaigns. We also see even plots, right? I think the Montenegro example is the most interesting one, where after the money invested in a pro-Russia candidate didn't result in his victory, and so there was this very elaborate plot where there was going to be kind of orchestrated violence to try to to undermine the newly elected government. It was foiled by the police, but it really shows kind of the variety of strategies that we see the Russian government employing. And I think it would be harder for Russia to do something like that in France, or in Germany, but in places that Russia has viewed historically as a part of its sphere of as part of its sphere of influence. That's where we really see kind of a lot more heavy-handed and a lot more blatant, intervention in an effort to secure kind of this territory as whether to protect itself from the West, or simply to demonstrate its power. Frankly, to just kind of as a showcase of Russia's power to be able to manipulate, have that much influence in the internal affairs of theoretically sovereign nations.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, this is in some respects, it's like being the first rocket into space. It's, oh, look what we can do. It's a show of power. It's and in some respects, a little easier to explain failures too. I mean, if a rocket doesn't make it all the way to space, that's a little hard to explain. If the election doesn't go the way you hope it did, there are other things, and you never really were admitting you were involved in it anyway.
Absolutely, and you usually have a backup plan anyway.
Yeah. Now, when it comes to the reaction to what Russia has done, President Obama invited several Russian diplomats to go back home. This probably brought back some nice memories for you in terms of U.S.-Soviet relations. What were the official reaction? What was the official action taken by the U.S.?
So the official action by the U.S. government, and I think, this is very interesting because I think it goes back to kind of the legacy of the Cold War. I think there's been a fair amount of criticism of the way that the current administration handled these accusations, right? And it has become clear that President Obama was aware of had concerns about what was going on. He privately communicated his concerns to Putin in meetings, but ultimately he didn't want to get involved during the campaign itself. And I think in large part, he probably thought that the result was going to be different. But also, I think it's starting up a conversation about Russia's nefarious plots in American politics brings in a lot of Cold War ideological baggage that most normal politicians don't necessarily want to do. And so it was interesting to see his reaction, right? 35 suspected intelligence agents were asked to leave. 2 compounds, Russian compounds were closed. And it's interesting because on the one hand, it doesn't seem like it's a lot. I will say this: I think for people in Russia, one of the interesting things that you see is that all the kind of the Russian government officials who are practically foam at the mouth about how much they love their country tend to prefer to not live in Russia. They like to have their children educated in the West. They like to invest their money in the West. They like to buy, houses, preferably, places like Miami and London, and not Russia. So actually, it may not seem like a big deal. But it probably is in some ways one of the most painful things you can do to some of these people, because again, they love Russia from a distance, much more passionately than I think they do when they actually have to be surrounded by Russia's reality. But I think, but in general, I think certainly it's hard to say. For me, as for before all this happened, right? It was right a couple of days before the New Year. All this talk about we're going to do something, and I kept thinking, what can really be done at this point, right? Even if there is incontrovertible, solid evidence that that the elections were tampered with, right? What can you really do now that the elections are over, the results have been certified, the Electoral College, has met? So in a sense, there's almost nothing that can really be done to restore the credibility of the political process and to really respond kind of with in a meaningful way. But at least for those 35 people, their life is going to suck a little bit more from this point on. So.
Yeah, and 35 people who cannot express their discontent.
Right, who have to continue to talk about how much they love, they love Russia and how awesome Russia is.
So in this case, actually minimizes damage or pain and suffering by actual Russians, except for these individuals.
And I should add that the original Russian response was that they were going to shut down an English language school in Moscow, but then Putin intervened, and magnanimously said that the school can remain, the school can remain open.
Invited people to visit Santa Claus even.
And and we can talk more about this later. But I think it is interesting that when Putin said that that there was not going to be this retaliation against against the children, which parenthetically is not actually that uncommon. In response to the Magnitsky Act a couple of years ago, the Russian response was to ban adoption of Russian children by by Americans, which ultimately hurt a lot of children more than anything else. So this idea that children have to be protected at all costs is not really is not significant here. But one of the really striking things was that Fox News, in response to Putin's comment, right, and now their headline was, "Putin won't stoop to Obama's level," right? So this idea that Russia, in response to being discovered to have done something illegal, Russia doesn't retaliate, and this is somehow taking the higher ground, is an interesting development in our political discourse.
Well, there is an interesting shift going on in terms of opinion of Russia. And we have some information to share. First of all, the way members of the EU view Russia in terms of favorability, and then we have some numbers regarding Vladimir Putin and President Obama and how they are viewed by Trump supporters, and then a couple of other things. But let's start with the way the members of the EU are looking at Russia right now. Anne, when you look at this, is there something that surprises you a little bit more than some of the others?
It doesn't. I'm not sure anything on this list really surprises me. I mean, I think one of the interesting things that we saw actually leading up to the election was that the only country that was excited about the possibility of Trump winning the American presidency was Russia, and so that was something that you could see that. So it's not surprising that so many of the countries in Europe have some serious concerns in light of this, and I think that. There are many reasons why there were concerns about the Trump election, but certainly his statements about NATO and his coziness and comfort with Putin and willingness to talk about the alleged killings of journalists and kind of minimizing so many of the essentially crimes of Putin's regime is something that made a lot of European countries, especially ones in closer proximity to Russia, very, very uncomfortable and very, very nervous. And so certainly the concerns don't, continuing to percolate.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's certainly true that the members of the EU don't appear to be huge fans of Russia. Jamie, is there anything that surprises you in the map?
Well, you see some regional variation. You see up in the northern parts of Europe much more skepticism toward Russia, and more favorability in the southeast and in Italy to some degree. So, but otherwise, not so much. There's some interesting things. We see a few places that have governments that are very sympathetic toward Russia, but populations that aren't. The clearest example here probably is Hungary, where the population is still quite skeptical of Putin, but the government is been very friendly toward Putin as it moves farther to the right and becomes more authoritarian. So too, to a lesser degree, in Poland, the government moving farther to the right, being more authoritarian. Population being quite skeptical of Russia, and there are very good historical reasons, of course, for Poles to be skeptical of Russia. If you don't mind, let me turn to one or two other things that have already been talked about. First of all, Putin's tactics. I mean, the man is brilliant with especially short-term political tactics. I mean, the idea of sort of refusing to take the seeming high road, refusing to expel U.S. diplomats in retaliation, pending whatever it is Trump will do, right? And also this obviously choreographed stage managing where his aides propose expulsions and Putin then the next day decides, no, I shall not expel. Obviously, this is all, yeah, it's good theater, and he knows how to do this kind of thing, and it was very smart tactically. One other thing I'd say about the U.S. reaction to what Obama did is, first of all, there wasn't anything more Obama could have done. I mean, what more are you going to do besides increase sanctions and expel diplomats? I mean, no one's talking about going to war against Russia for something like this. So he did everything he could. Again, we see divisions within the Republican establishment. We see John McCain, Republican senator from Arizona and chair of the Senate Armed Services Committee, strongly in favor of Obama's moves. However, we see some really interesting trends in Republican votes, and we have a few slides on this. On the one hand, we have opinion among Trump voters of Vladimir Putin, favorable opinion of 35%. So less than a majority, but still, geez, you wouldn't expect it to be more than very, very low. Respect for a foreign leader who is a sort of known autocrat, human rights violator, just generally kind of cruel and nasty in so many ways. And the other thing we have is a slide of is net favorability of the CIA. And we see, and of course, the Republican voters have for so long been very, very staunch supporters of the CIA and, of course, the entire national security establishment. And we see Republican support for the CIA fall from 60% in 2011 to 4% in 2016. I mean, that's just stunning. And shows, once again, divisions within the Republican Party and a dramatic turnaround because of the influence of Donald Trump and his attitudes toward Russia and the whole dynamic we're talking about here with Vladimir Putin.
Well, of course, with Putin, when you say he's a strong leader, he's somebody who stands up for his country, for a lot of people who are feeling disaffected here, that sounded good. And they maybe for the first time sort of looked at Putin in a different way and said, well, that's a strong leader. I guess I can like him. Still, 51% had an unfavorable
and that's
view.
important to note. Yeah.
But, barely a majority.
But still, the 35% is stunning.
It is stunning.
And compared to 9% of...
Right. Now, I was going to point out that with the 9%, though, if you simply look at what Republicans and Democrats typically have as views of the opponent candidate, those numbers aren't that unusual. They're a little low, but it's not that unusual for the opposing presidential candidate to be very low in terms of favorability and very high in terms of lack of favorability. These are obviously they're expanded here. They're larger than before. And then when you look at the CIA numbers and you see that huge drop, I think it's safe to say that this is one of those times when if history shows something, what we'll probably see is a rebound of some kind in a fairly short period of time.
I would think so.
That's not to say that the 4% is not accurate. It's just that it's a blip. Polls are telling us what's happening at that moment, and that's it. So this could be one of those blips that we're going to see, and then it'll pop back up, especially when President-elect Trump becomes President Trump, and suddenly it's his person running the CIA, and the CIA is doing his work.
And if, as is very likely, relations don't remain quite so warm once Trump has, important foreign policy decisions to make.
Yeah.
Well, and I don't disagree that, it captures a moment. I think it definitely captures a moment in time, a very interesting moment in time, but still a moment in time. But it is important to note that, if we think about, it's obviously almost impossible to predict what's actually going to happen once Trump is officially sworn in. But at least in the last week, one of the things that we have seen is actually kind of a concerted effort on the part of Trump to undermine the CIA and kind of the intelligence community more broadly, right? Essentially lying about them not being prepared to brief him, talking about the fact that he knows more than they do. Again, kind of taking Assange's word over the word of the the intelligence community. And I believe it was either yesterday or this morning, right? Trump talking about how he wants to scale back on the CIA and restructure the CIA. So I think this is where this blip issue. It's not. Depending on what he's able to do, right? We have to. It's not clear that whatever the CIA is going to be after this, that it's really going to be quite the same. Quite the same institution. And there are some people who have suggested that, given the fact that he seems to be actively disrespecting, right, the expertise and the work that the members of the CIA are doing, it's not unlikely that many people will leave, right? That a lot of the experts, a lot of people who've devoted their lives to this are not going to want to work in this kind of climate, especially if they're going to have to work, with people like Flynn. And so again, the institution may actually change. So in a sense, even if its approval increases, it may be a very different institution, moving forward. And since one of the big concerns about Trump is and his it's not so much that it's such a problem for us to improve our relationship with Russia, right? That's not the issue. It's the question of sort of the president-elect taking Russia's word over the word of the intelligence community, right? Picking Russia's side. And of course, the question is, why does he keep doing this, right? And again, whether it's because he's just a maverick who does whatever, or we don't actually know. There are a lot of questions about his business dealings, right, and financial relationships with, with Russia. So again, it's not clear whether or not him becoming president will actually result in him actually making some difficult decisions. But it could, in fact, be a continuation of, I'll use the word appeasement essentially of Russia to protect his other interests that we may not, necessarily even know the details of.
Jamie?
I'd just like to underscore how truly extraordinary it is that a significant section of the American electorate has quite suddenly come to be just utterly skeptical of, and indeed opposed to, the conclusions of our national intelligence agencies, as we've discussed, all of which are probably very united on this matter. And moreover, deeply skeptical of a conclusion that says that a foreign power, a great power competitor, supposedly, skeptical of the idea that a great power competitor has actively intervened in an American electoral process. I mean, regardless of whom you wanted to win this election, it's deeply disturbing, and it's, I think, even more disturbing that many people seem suddenly to have been willing to throw these institutions of American government under the bus.
Now, this is interesting. You've mentioned a couple times, Jamie, a division within the Republican Party, and you quoted from Lindsey Graham. We have a tweet from John McCain, who was overseas. This is kind of an interesting moment because in some respects you have folks who would normally be considered hawks, like a John McCain, who are in some respects the voice now or the opposition to Putin in a way that you would normally expect the president to be. Is this sort of surprising?
I think it is. It's definitely again, as a historian, it's definitely surprising to me because during the Cold War, anti-communism was embraced by the majority of the majority of mainstream political figures, but certainly it was a mantle that the Republicans carried perhaps more proudly. And so it's particularly interesting. I hate to use this cliche, right? But the idea that the party of Reagan suddenly is now trying to talk about how amazing Putin is peculiar. To kind of say the mildest word I can say about it is peculiar. And I think we see it. It's interesting that we have, of course, people like McCain, who I swear I think was trolling Trump because he was the tweet that Andy mentioned, right? Trump was essentially visiting Ukrainian military on New Year's, giving kind of handing out presents and taking pictures and posting this on his account. The various Ukrainian accounts posted this as well, and he specifically talks about we will stand with them in their fight against Putin's aggression, right? So here's somebody who kind of is very strongly pointing this direction. At the same time, he seems to now be kind of walking back his desire to have, a Senate and, a Senate committee being formed to investigate what's actually going to happen. So I think this is going to be a huge test for people like Lindsey Graham, for people like John McCain. How much are they willing to stand up and fight for this? To go in line with their usual political commitments. But you also have I would say maybe lower tiered politicians, and I say lower tiered mostly because I think they never had the opportunity to be prominent before, but they might now, who seem to be viewing this as an opportunity to take advantage of Trump's affinity for Russia to showcase theirs, right? You have people like Dana Rohrabacher, right, who has a long history of love for Putin, suddenly gaining prominence and talking about how this is something we should have done all along. You have people. Actually, I think he's also from Arizona, Representative Franks, who in response to the hacking accusations, he said, if Russia succeeded in giving us information that was accurate, they merely did what the media should have done, right? Essentially saying, right, and so one of the questions is, okay, so is he saying that, all politicians' private records are open, for hacking? So there definitely seems to be this really interesting kind of clash within the Republican Party, and one of the tests is going to be, is this a line that they're going to be willing to, to fight for in their commitment to national security, or are they going to, roll over, as they have done on many, on many other things? But it's also a flip for the Democrats, right? Because we've been mainly talking about the Republicans, but it's interesting to see the Democratic Party so staunchly defending the CIA, right, as this great institution, not something that they have done for quite some time, right? So there's been a fair amount of skepticism about CIA's activities abroad, including, interestingly enough, intervention in other countries' elections. And so now to have the Democrats sort of fighting to clear the good name of the CIA while the Republicans are flinging mud at it, it's just a very bizarre moment, I think, in our political culture, where the law, the traditional alliances seem to be really, kind of breaking down. It'll be so interesting to see how it shapes up.
Yeah. Now the tweet from John McCain was, "Spending New Year's Eve with brave Ukrainian Marines at a forward combat outpost. We stand with them in their fight against Putin's aggression." So this is a very clear statement from Senator John McCain. Jamie, there are some people who are actually speculating that folks like McCain and Graham, who this is not to say that they are not doing what they believe in terms of wanting to hold hearings and visiting other places and making statements like this. Very recently, McCain referred to Putin as a thug. He used other language that not particularly complimentary language. Yeah. But there are some who are saying what's actually happening here is an attempt by Congress to grab back some of their authority and make Trump a little bit weaker as a president. Do you give that much stock?
Oh, yeah. One thing that a lot of people tend to forget about politics or not realize is that there are very important institutional interests at play. And so just the other day, for example, we saw the House Republican caucus, right, try to take power over the House Ethics Office, and we saw Trump, of course, send a tweet saying, "Wow, that was a really dumb thing to do. Why don't you focus on the issues we care about?" And within hours, the Republican Party in the House of Representatives had decided not to do what they had decided to do the night before. So there we see a bit of a power struggle that's institutional. It's not just over policy, or maybe not that much over policy. It's really institutional between the presidency and the House, both controlled by the same party. And I think, we've been talking about McCain and Graham and these tensions too. So I think there is no doubt that many senators, many House members care deeply about the institutional autonomy of Congress and recognize that now they have a president with a tremendous amount of personal charisma and a pretty fired up voter base, and that they're going to have to work to sort of make sure they can still have a say. They may agree with Trump most of the time, but when they don't, they want to carve out some degrees of freedom.
Mm-hmm. Now, Ann brought up an interesting situation where the Democrats seem to be defending something that historically they were not particularly aggressive about defending. Are we finding that there are new alliances that are going to get formed during this? I know I spoke with voters who actually said, I'm voting for Trump because I believe it will break down old party lines, old alliances will disappear, and new ones will be formed to fight him on some issues and to be with him on some others. Are we seeing, is this a matter of the left and the right sort of actually coming around to meet each other someplace?
I think in some ways it is. For example, we see The Nation, a bastion of left-wing argument and intellectual life in the United States. It's been around since 1865, I think. The Nation has throughout the campaign been saying that the one thing Trump's right about is that we have to be very friendly toward Russia and we have to stop this antagonism toward Russia. So we see some meeting around left and right. But I think more importantly, not different from what your question was, but in a broader sense, let's say, I think we're really going to see some pretty fundamental restructuring of American political parties and the alignments between voters and parties. And I don't know how it's going to turn out. I don't think anybody does, but it could be really, really interesting. I mentioned earlier the huge shift, and this is really big, by Trump on trade, right? The Republican Party, long the bastion of free trading, and here is Trump, of course, very, very powerfully going against free trade. What's going to happen with the Republican Party? Are free trading Wall Street Republicans, who are often more socially liberal than the rest of the party, going to break free or become Democrat? Who knows? And then there are parts of the Democratic base that are disaffected, and Democrats, of course, are concerned about assembling a coalition that can win next time. So who's that going to be beyond whom they have now? So I think Trump is really shaken up American politics, and it could be very interesting to see 4 or 8 years down the road, how American voters and parties respond.
We should point out that when you say who can win, the Democrats have to be figuring out who can win. They don't mean just the presidency.
They don't. They mean
actually
everything.
trying to get control of Congress, at least one chamber. They mean several governorships they've lost, general assemblies they've lost at the state level.
You know better than anyone, Andy, governorships and state legislatures overwhelmingly controlled by Republicans these days. So Democrats have a very, very long hill to climb. And until Trump's victory, it had been assumed for the past 48 years that the one place where Democrats generally had a pretty good built-in advantage was the presidency.
Now there is, we do have to show one more slide before we get into our last subject, and that is one of a box of sugar, I believe it was you said, and there were some folks who were pretty happy in Russia about the results of it. So describe the box for us.
This is a commemorative. This is a commemorative box of sugar that is. Oh, sorry. That commemorates. It's literally a commemorative box of sugar to celebrate Trump's victory. I should say that copyright issues in Russia are a little fuzzy, so I'm sure I don't know if Trump is aware that his likeness has been used in this way and whether he got a cut of something, or not. But I mean, the sugar aside, there have also been billboards in Russia, kind of showing images of Trump and Putin next to each other, kind of making the world great again, kind of definitely playing on that terminology, and there's been, Obama was definitely not somebody who was popular, was popular in Russia, and I think part of it does have to do with American foreign policy, and part of it fundamentally has to do with racism. And so there's definitely kind of this glee that Obama is leaving, and somebody like Trump is coming in. But ultimately, I think among kind of regular people. But as far as Russian politicians are concerned, I mean, one of the big questions, of course, is why are they so happy about Trump? And again, kind of comes back to this issue of what do they, why is he behaving the way that, he also praised the way Putin responded to Obama's sanctions, right? He then pinned that tweet, right? I mean, he pinned a tweet that was praising Putin. That was retweeted by various Russian, organizations. I mean, it creates a very strange, very, very strange dynamic, and it raises questions about what, I mean, again, it's not a question of, should we be friendlier to Russia, but the kind of the obsequiousness with which he seems to do it, and his admiration for somebody who is a strong leader who is against democratic freedoms, is something that raises some serious questions and concerns about what drives that behavior. And a number, the intelligence community seems concerned because it's a kind of behavior that's usually done by people who have been compromised in some way. So again, it raises questions about, what does it mean, and what will it mean for the rest of us?
Yeah. Now we have just a few minutes left, and the election is one thing, but really the rubber will hit the road when we start talking specific policy issues. And one that I think we can get into briefly, but deserving of much more time, would be the relationship between Russia, for that matter, Turkey, and the United States regarding Syria. In about a minute or so, what do you see? How do you see that playing out in the near future? Jamie, let's start with you.
Okay, well, I think the most important short-term thing to note is that more or less the moment after Trump was elected, by which I mean within the next several days, we see Russian military involvement in Syria really ratcheting up, and we see tremendous human rights atrocities occur in Aleppo and the fall of the city of Aleppo after 4 years or so to Syrian government forces. So what we see is Russia taking full advantage of this shift in American political power, and I think what this tells us is that for all the nice happy talk between Trump and Putin, and this is a honeymoon period for Trump because he hasn't had to make any real decisions yet, Putin is ready to take advantage of any American. He's already taken advantage of Trump's victory by sending a signal that Russia is going to play tough. And I don't think it's going to be all warm and friendly between the two of us for all that long.
Anne?
I mean, ultimately, I think it's going to be really bad for Syria. Worse for Syria if that can be imagined. But I think, this is going to be. I think this is a really important moment for the United States because, in a sense, it forces the United States to reevaluate its role in the world. we haven't really had to do that, too much since, essentially since the end of the Cold War. And so this is going to be the big test. Russia's obviously very interested in showcasing its power in a variety of different ways on the international arena. And so and we know from past history that if not met with some force, Russia will keep moving forward. So the big test for the U.S. is going to be, will Russia be allowed to do so in Syria or anywhere else, or is something going to be done?
Mm-hmm. So is this Russia's move back to being a world power very quickly, very, very quickly?
This is Russia's attempt to do that, but the short answer here is that Russia is still fundamentally very weak compared to most great powers that we would think of. And this is Vladimir Putin playing a very good hand with very weak cards.
Anne?
I agree, but I will say that I think ultimately Russia's goals have changed. I think they probably do realize that they don't have the great power capability in the traditional definition of great power, so they'll settle for just undermining the rest of us, right? If they can't be strong, they'll settle for us being weak, and interference in elections and undermining democratic institutions, the press, reality, facts, all of that is part of that strategy, and arguably much more damaging than anything else they can do.
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to thank everyone for watching and listening to us. I want to thank our guests, Associate Professor of History and Livschiz, Associate Professor of Political Science, James Toole. My name is Andrew Downs. I've been happy to moderate this. This event was brought to you by the Departments of History and Political Science at IPFW, as well as the American Democracy Project. And as always, we want to thank the folks at College TV for letting us use the studio and making this available, our friends over at WBOI, and finally, of course, the Helmke Library. Thank you very much for joining us.